Hello.
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 Good evening, all.
Hey.
We are live on Beside the Rookery with Andy, Chris, and me to talk about WFRP, as we are all former WFRP writers or designers, developers, and we are preparing for our stream next week. So what is the idea of the Beside the Rookery this week? It is to have a chat about next week's stream. What else have we got coming up tonight, Andy?
What else? I mean, we can also discuss what's going out for the Brazen Rooks this week, but we can do that at the end. Not this week, the week after. Graham's got a special stream lined up for them. But I think right now we are focusing in on the rather impressive dev chat. I do hate that word, dev. That dev chat that we've got planned for next week with developers from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1, 2, 3. and 4 all gathered in one place for the first time ever. It's going to be kind of awesome.
And what's that you have behind you, Andy?
I think I have all 4 editions of Warhammer in the house. Wow. Can you see there? There, right over there, there's Graham's baby, right from the very beginning. And then we move over to Chris Pramas' baby, back to front. Then we move over to Jay's baby right here, with a little bit of the old special edition from 2nd edition, which isn't seen very often. And then, of course, the good old Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4, the current edition that we are all playing just now, or at least many of us are playing just now, at least.
Oh, we have already got quite a lot of questions in for next week's stream that are piling up, and we asked people to come on tonight and just give us a few more ideas and suggestions, what you would like people to talk about. We've got a question. It's quite... right on time tonight. So Jaleb asked on Discord, what WFRP career would you assign to each of next week's guests?
And this is where I bow out and I say, I'll let other people discuss this one since it potentially involves me. And I will also add, if you've got any ideas for things that you would like to bring up, not just in terms of questions to be asked, but anything you'd like our chat to cover next week, bring it up now. We can discuss it. If you've got any ideas, bring it up and we can have a chat amongst ourselves as to whether it's a good idea or not. But beyond that, I shall now bow down while the careers are horrendously assigned.
I've had about 10 minutes to think about this, and so far I've only thought of one for one person, and that is for Chris Pramas, who would definitely be a cook because he is a great chef. He really loves food. When he came over to visit us, we went out for dinner. We had really good chats. We had, as is traditional for Green Ronin, cheese at their hotel. And I'm always seeing him making... In fact, today, I think he may even have made scones. I saw on his Facebook. So, nice. Yeah, he's definitely... I'm not going to say a halfling chef because, I mean, I'm smaller than Chris. So if Chris was a halfling, then I would be a gnome. But only because halflings are the best chefs.
True.
It is known.
True fact.
So, yeah.
I mean, I think Andy, it depends. If we're sticking to just 4th edition stuff, then demagogue, maybe? I don't know. but if we're allowing sort of 2nd edition custom careers and stuff, I gotta say the horse coper. From back in the day, Swiss Tony, the horse coper.
That one's in the Kislev book, the horse coper.
The Kislev book.
Yeah. It's in the Kislev book, Realm of the Ice Queen. And I slipped that one in. And indeed, he does look like, Fast Tony. Because as he should do from the Fast Show. Because selling horses is much like making love to a beautiful woman.
Oh my gosh. Look who's
Chris!
You summoned him with your talk of cheese.
We were just discussing you right this very second and your great love of cheese.
Oh, yes. Well, it's true.
Yeah, well, this is why, because someone asked what career do you assign to each of next week's guests, and I said the only person I can think of so far is Chris, and he would be a cook or a chef because he is a great lover of food and cooker of food. Yeah.
And I said I would bow out of the question because it was about me. So...
I don't know Jay, so I'm looking forward to meeting Jay next week. So I would really hesitate to assign a career to someone who I have literally exchanged 2 emails with.
Well, I'm curious to hear what career people think I would have, other than, I guess, chef isn't really an adventuring career, is it? But
I would say
Warhammer.
This is WFRP, right? So So the halfling chef is a core staple of any adventuring group. It's like the bard of Warhammer. If you don't have a chef to keep your spirits up, what have you got? You're eating Warpstone.
Dysentery. That's what you've got.
That's what you've got.
I am currently in a life and death struggle with a 1 pound block of blue cheese. So it was sent to us as an anniversary gift. And it's just a lot of cheese. A whole pound.
I've got to warn you, it is possible. I had a similar thing with a giant block of Stilton I got one Christmas, and we eventually finished it, but I haven't eaten Stilton since, and that's been like 8 years, I think. So yeah, it broke me.
Yeah. So just so that it's done, so we have a couple of introductions since Chris has joined us. Chris, meet Lindsay, who you know. Meet Andy Leask. Andy Leask did a lot of writing on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition in the core book as Starter Set et al. Down beneath me here, we have another Chris. And he wrote adventures for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4.2. And they've come in to discuss what sort of things we should probably chat about next week beyond the norm and the expected. Because the obvious thing is we get some questions in, but somebody might come up with an idea, and they chat. I don't know if you've used StreamYard before, but if you look over at the right-hand side, you should be able to see the comments that are coming in. So if there's anyone out there who'd like some comments and throw them in, for example, Lindsay, you know, I knew it, or Cabal Groves, Lindsay can bring those comments up during the stream.
Another stream, another time the Andes have coordinated sweaters. Yeah, I feel it's like there are more, at one point, maybe there still are, there were more CEOs of FTSE 100 companies in the UK called John than there were women. And I feel a little bit like that tonight. There's like 2 Andys, 2 Chris's. I feel a bit outnumbered by.
But you are wearing a little bit of the old checkered plaid there, along with that, Chris. You're matching.
True.
I'll take that as a match. We've got 2 Chris's and 2 Andys. We need some designation here.
Well, it is flannel season here in Seattle, so I got to fly the flannel. Yeah.
So, as I was saying, if anyone's got any questions out there for what you think we should do, or comments for what you think we should cover, send them on in. If you've got any questions as a sort of prequel to what we're going to be discussing next week, now's the time to ping them. All you people out there, he said, waving over at the screen where I can see everyone on Twitch, do ping them over and say hi. But beyond that, thanks very much for joining us, Chris. Super appreciated. I'm slightly surprised. You just appeared like magic.
Well,
I know I'm looking down at the bottom to see if anyone else will appear.
You never can be sure, can you? You've got your edition right there, and over in the corner there too. Got the special edition of it, which is, nice. I'll admit, a touch dusty.
Yeah. So for the stream next week, we've got so far. I'm not going to tell people the questions yet, but some of a sample are about Albion, about favorite mechanics. What else have we got? What would you consider the greatest strength of each edition? So yeah, there's a questions mixing up both the lore and also the mechanics and of the editions.
I think mechanics will be particularly interesting because we all had completely different jobs. For Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1, they were starting from scratch, making their own version of D&D / Call of Cthulhu. I mean, you could try and pretend it's something else, but we all know it's kind of not. While simultaneously drawing upon all the Warhammer lore, such as it was then, and creating it. Where then Chris comes along and he's got to do an update of an existing beloved property. Trying to streamline what were a host of known issues then, and create something that would be as beloved. And then Jay came along and he made a completely different game, which almost started afresh. And then I came along, and I was employed to go back to 1 and 2 and sneak in some bits of 3. And create again something that was both new and also not. So, yeah, I think it'll be an interesting chat in that regard because we all have quite a different job.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up the different editions and how you start off going. Warhammer's basically Call of Cthulhu with the Warhammer World wrapper on it, and it's I was on a different podcast called Realm of Fire, and we were talking about I was doing a follow-up because I got asked about Wrath and Glory and how that compares to the other ones. And again, I think there was a previous comment because they did an episode before talking about the history of the 40k RPGs, and it was like, what makes them? Is there anything that's distinctly 40k about them? And it's just like, isn't it just Call of Cthulhu bolt guns? Like, is that it? But I think what will be interesting, I'm sure, in that discussion with all the developers, gathered together, is how mostly over the editions, more and more Warhammer is baked into the rule set, and you kind of get that mood and theme across without it just being if you wipe away everything. It's like there's the bare bones mechanics, and you could run Call of Cthulhu there. So I think that'll be a really interesting discussion to hear.
It's particularly interesting as well because now we're on to the 4th edition of the game. There's enough movement in terms of how everybody appreciates what Warhammer is that there's an awful lot of groups who don't even play with Warhammer. They like the setting, so they will play it with their own favorite rules. And that could be, for example, the age system, which Chris has got when you're down in that direction. It could be their own homebrews. It could be taking something simpler, because there's all manner of simpler systems. You go really basic down to your fighting fantasy warlock style systems, to even some people using D&D. And I say even because in the Warhammer community, there's a touch of, you couldn't use D&D for Warhammer, crime! And there's much angst and twirling of fists and moustaches. But people are using all manner of different systems to play the same game these days. And I find that as well an interesting angle, particularly from the perspective of those of us who were trying to create it, because we were always trying to both take what was there and make it work the best that it possibly can, but also make it as open as possible to the entire, shall we say, gaming public. It's one thing that I thought Chris did really well with his edition, in that you can almost feel the influences of D&D as it was in that age. Not a surprise given Chris's background, I presume. But you can feel the influences of D&D at that age on the rule set that he eventually created. And I think it's to its strength, both because it helped streamline areas where Warhammer needed streamlined, but it also made it just that little bit more approachable to the wider gaming audience at the time. But Chris may disagree with that.
Well, I mean, honestly, I wasn't really thinking about D&D per se, but because I was a long time Warfare player, and so when I started the project, like I had my things that always irritated me, that I wanted to do something about, but like I always have as kind of a bee in my bonnet, a desire to make RPGs easy for people to get into, and as approachable as possible. So that kind of guided a lot of what I did. And really, that's how the age system also came about, because BioWare had asked us to do a tabletop RPG based on their Dragon Age video game. And I felt like that was a great opportunity to take video gamers and turn them on to tabletop. So the whole age system was designed with that in mind.
Yeah, and I think nails it.
So
happy nail it comment.
There's a great new D&D book that's quite Warhammery in a comedic way. Brancalonia, an Italian game based on folkloric Renaissance Italy.
Wow, where can I get that? I need to get that now.
I've still not read it.
Is it in English?
I believe
Is there an English version?
I don't know. I've quite a few people have posted me and said, "Hey, Andy, you should be looking at this." To which I went, "Of course." Thank you very much, Zoltan.
Zoltan said yes. It's in Italian and English.
Good to know.
Cool.
Right, I'll get one of those straight away.
I've seen some covers and things on Facebook.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I'd heard mention of it, but hadn't seen it that much. Sorry, Chris.
I was going to bring up a question for Chris about the age system. You're saying like trying to get computer gamers into, trying to bridge that gap and draw them into tabletop RPGs. And something I've seen related to the other game I've written for, which is Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. And you often see a lot of angst about, it's been dumbed down and so forth. And what's your opinion on that, knowing that you designed a system to grab a new audience, knowing that people might complain like, oh, well, this doesn't cater to the traditional gamer? Like, how do you kind of approach that, I guess, angst?
So when I designed the Dragon Age game, that was 8 years since the whole like D20 revolution, as it were. And we published like a lot of D20 stuff in our early days. That's kind of what put us on the map. But the continuing complexity of D&D 3.5 and its spin-off systems, like it just felt to me like not just noobs would appreciate a simpler system. That I felt like there was a desire in the larger gaming public, people who maybe came in through D&D 3rd edition or 3.5, like would be pleased to see something, that wasn't like, here's 800 prestige classes. And
Yeah.
So true.
Yeah.
Here's a question. What part of WFRP's rules do you think really integrate into the world? I can't imagine WFRP without careers. It ties the character to the setting much more than just what they can spend XP on. And then Scar has said careers is a must-have. On careers, I think they're helpful for writing and developing for NPCs, because you can show a career path that gives a flavor of the background of that NPC. I don't know, like knight that is completely different from the next NPC knight just by the career path, which is very efficient in words.
It is. And also, particularly for the careers, it's not just that it's Warhammer to its core, which it kind of is now. It's from a writing perspective, it also gives you an opportunity to delve quite deeply into the world without a large world section. Because it speaks to not just the type of characters that are on offer and the tone of the game itself, but it speaks to the development of the world and how those careers manifest within that world. And you get those lovely little 200-word skits that go into just that little bit more depth that you'll often get in other role-playing games, where that depth is either assumed because you create your own career styles or something similar within the cultures or whatever is presented in the game at hand. Or alternatively, it's just a large world section. It's quite a nice way of fragmenting it in a way that's also easy to parse and read for somebody who's new to the game world. I quite like the career system for that.
It's very, like, particularly, and again, I think second edition did an excellent job of this. Was how like real world the jobs were. Like, they were the careers that actual people living in the Warhammer world would have. And as you say, Andy, that adds so much in terms of the world building, but it takes you beyond the classic fantasy archetypes into the idea that you're playing an actual person, an actual character, and that grounded kind of grimy low level thing for characters is integral to a lot of people's vision of Warhammer. Not all. I know some people do like playing the kind of bigger archetypal kind of heroes, but that grounded style, I think, is so fundamental to what a lot of people want, and it's the careers that do that, I think. So
yeah, Rangdo says that's what I like about the careers. They smuggle a huge amount of lore, not just into the game, but into the creation of the character. And certainly when we were writing for them for WFRP 4, like I felt like I had failed if I hadn't imparted at least 2 or 3 ways in each career that career was like somehow different from just, I don't know, a monk in D&D. How is a nun different? How, like, what differentiates this game? And also a few seeds for why a villager or why, I don't know, a bailiff might end up adventuring.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the only thing with the careers in WFRP is like, right, so I'm going to start as a bailiff, but I'm immediately going to, I don't know, leave Altdorf as an outlaw and go into the outlaw career, which is more, maybe because I can't perceive how my bailiff and my herbalist and my chef and my, I don't know, rat catcher can become an adventuring party.
I think another great thing about the careers is just that it lets you know the first time you read over the basic careers, like, you immediately understand that this is different from other fantasy RPGs, where it's like, you might start as a charcoal burner, probably very few D&D characters have
Look,
started.
Hey, Jay!
Hello.
Okay, I think it's time for introductions again. I'll pass it to Lindsay this time to do the introductions.
Hi. Yes. So we've got everyone's names have disappeared. Now
That's
we're
because you've
so
got the comment up.
small.
There we go.
There we go. They're back. Yeah. So Andy Leask, writer on WFRP 4. Andy Law, designer and developer WFRP 4. Chris, Chris without a last name on the stream.
Yeah, sorry.
A writer from WFRP 4, and Chris Pramas. I don't know if you know Chris Pramas already. Who is
Industry-wise
a developer? Yeah, everyone knows.
Yeah.
Chris.
Yeah.
Not as true as it used to be, but thank you. Yeah, I don't think Jay and I have ever actually met. So.
I think we met at Gen Con years ago, but
Okay. Yeah.
I figured you might have met at some time.
We were in the process of discussing what rules felt particularly Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which is, I think, a pertinent one given you've now walked in, given that you were in quite a different position to, say, Chris and I, where we were adapting effectively the first edition of the game.
Yeah.
Where you didn't so much adapt the first edition of the game. You came in and went, right, let's start from the ground up. And brought quite a different game to the table. But nevertheless, there's still some staples of Warhammer that are in your edition.
Yep.
And the one that we were just discussing was careers, and careers are hard-coded into your edition as well. And we were just going through the career system and why we thought it was so Warhammer. So that's you caught up.
oh yeah. If you couldn't be a rat catcher, then there's something wrong.
Yeah. We were just talking about I was saying, like, why does a bailiff become an adventurer, but bailiff to outlaw. It wasn't that I didn't play a bailiff, it's just that all of our characters end up becoming outlaws at some point. That's kind of
Such is the nature of Warhammer.
Such is the nature of Warhammer.
It's telling the strength of the career system because so I'm currently writing on the Iron Kingdom's Requiem, which is D&D 5e, but the previous edition also had a career system of sorts. And again, it was pretty much, I think they realized it was impossible to make every single like character archetype or what you could buy a miniature of in War Machine and Hordes. But if you combine two careers together, you could create a mounted gun mage, or you could create a storm knight who was also like a cleric. And so you can get that diversity in it. So I think that's obviously clearly saying, yeah, thanks Warhammer for doing the career system, because that guided us so well on how to implement it in a fairly similar kind of genre mashup fantasy setting.
The most complex project I worked on was actually the last second edition project. So Fantasy Flight finished 2 second edition projects before we started third edition. And the last official second ed product was the Career Compendium, which brought every single career from every single splat book and supplement into one book. And we tried to make sure that all the paths connected from every single career into every other. It was nightmarish because there are 220 careers.
Oh, I know a chunk of them.
And then, trying to grab one from the Tome of Corruption and trying to grab one from this other one and making sure that it's there and that we make the right references to, now you can become a cultist. Now you can become whatever it might be. Oof, that was a huge undertaking.
To bounce that off on fourth, the issues that had come from second, where it had just sort of proliferated into lots of careers everywhere, and in third, where there was lots of basics, a few second tier, a few third, and very few top tier careers. So with fourth, every single career has a level 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of its natural 4 tiers. So every career is actually 4 careers. So 64 basic careers for a total of 256 careers, meaning that every beginning has got an end. So a 4th level top end as well as a starting point. That was to help consolidate that. And also, as you may have noted in third, you got rid of all the career exits and similar new keywords. That was a good idea. That certainly made it much more adaptable for later when you're adding new careers in. And to a degree,
exactly
the same thing. Yeah, I can see why that occurred.
I kind of like career exits because it gives you something to aim
It tells
for.
stories.
Yeah.
I like the career entry and exit system, but for forward compatibility, since I knew eventually I would be passing the line off to somebody else, the trait system worked because you can come up with new traits all you want if we need to come up with high elf only careers or something else. So it was more a matter of convenience that we felt still paid homage to the career system, even though you didn't have the direct links, like Chris said, that told a coherent in-game story.
I like those stories. In a perfect world, I'd have probably kept them in fourth. Because I actually like them and agree with Chris because they do tell stories and they help GMs and players for the future. The way fourth does it, you're very much left with classes, which were brought back from first edition. There's 8 general classes, and your own career, which had an automatic endpoint. So the classes sort of generally give you an idea of where you could go for a bit cheaper on the XP, and your career itself had a natural endpoint, but it still didn't tell the same stories. And I think those stories were something that was lost from first and second that I actually quite liked.
Yeah, and you could see that. Yeah, I mean, even just in the conversations that we had with people, like just after 4th edition went live, and the amount that people's thinking is constrained by what they see on the page. So people saw those tiers and assumed you couldn't move to other careers, and the rules are there. They're front and center. They're not buried, but people, by seeing that kind of, you those 4 tiers of a career, people assumed that you were locked within that, and there was no way for you to kind of get out. And I think you also lost. I mean, we did our best to make them as flavoursome as possible, but we had to condense quite a lot of them. And I remember genuinely the most lamented career was the charcoal burner. And we had to keep saying that career, I can't remember, it was villager or whatever, that career mentions charcoal burning in it, and they're like, but it's not the same, and you have to be like, yeah, it's not the same, but I have to defend it, but it's not the same. You're right.
I just know when I was just playing Wolfrip in college, and my long-running character finally made it into the witch hunter career. It was extremely satisfying. It was like, yes, finally. I've been dreaming of this moment.
You can relate backward from whatever goal you had, which I liked. Sometimes it took a little bit of research, but it's like, all right, I want to be a champion. So I've got to eventually get into one of these 2 careers. Well, I can get into those from any one of these 4 careers. I really enjoyed that aspect of it. A lot of my other friends are just like, I just want to kill goblins with sticks, right? So what careers have a plus attack bonus? And all they wanted to do was go to the careers that increased weapon skill and number of attacks per round, and that was all they focused on ever.
Yeah, we people like that.
I mean, in some respects, that's what happened with Fantasy Roleplay 1 and 2, in that there wasn't, and to a degree 3 as well, there was only so many end goals because there was very few very top tier careers in comparison to the wide spread of basic careers. So everybody had quite a different beginning, and if you only played for the classic 6 to 12 sessions, you generally found that you got a little bit of variety in there and everything was fine and no one looked otherwise. But for everyone who was playing a long-term campaign, so if they played the Enemy Within or any of the other ones, say the Paths of the Damned or anything similar, the Thousand Thrones, all of those campaigns generally required at least half a year to a year's worth of play to complete. So you tended to find that most of the groups ended up looking the same come the end, even though they had such different beginnings, particularly with Fantasy Roleplay 1, which was almost the worst, where everyone ended up being an assassin, a wizard, a witch hunter, et al. And to a degree, that was something that Fourth tried to fix by giving 64 top ends for 64 beginnings. But as Jalib quite rightly points here, it does give you that feeling that once you're in a career, you kind of stick with it, which I suppose sort of fits the medieval feel. You know, you're born into your class and your career, and I could argue that, but it's gas. Because we all who played Warhammer back in the day, we all enjoyed planning out our careers and our different career trees and where we go. And I agree with Jalib, it does feel a bit more stuff.
Can we see on the Riverfolk one? So there may have been some comments about that, but we talked about that during development, and one of the reasons for that, which Andy Law told me, was that the initial starting kind of place for 4th edition was the right plan next to the right. So it was quite purposeful that there were 8 Riverfolk careers.
Yeah, it was supposed to support a particular style of play, which was supposed to be developed at a later point, presumably now, by somebody else. And to add extra classes as required.
Yeah. Another thing just on that, like, because I totally agree. Like, I was very much a theory crafter in terms of sitting and plotting out career paths as well. But equally, sometimes what would happen is the opposite of that, in that you would go into a career and then a surprise career exit would be there. You're like, oh, I've never thought of that. And it could actually, as a player, open up possibilities you never would have considered as you end up kind of going down a route and becoming something quite different. So
I think it's one of the strengths of the career system in general.
Yeah.
Because
I was going to say with the career system, though, I mean, the example is in Enemy Within 2, is it not? Or is it in 1 and then into 2 when you as the GM introduce a reason for characters to have a career, which they may not even have the prerequisites to go into it, but circumstance allows them to get the training. So I think the other thing that we've mostly not said is that just because the career system as written it's there, that doesn't prevent a GM going like, well, there's a war going on, so you could get trained up. There are people walking around training soldiers right now. Go train with a sword, you peasant,
Yeah.
Like, go do it.
Andy Law, as our forever GM, is a big proponent of doing exactly that. Like, something happens in the plot, and at the end of the night, you'll get your experience, and you'll be told, and you also now have the opportunity to go into the whatever career is.
Not that I'm still bitter at being the party boatman for blooming ages, but anyway.
For me, one of the side effects of the career system is the games that we played tended to cover a longer span of in-game time. So in D&D, you might go from 1st to 5th level in a month in-game, where with the career system, switching careers, like we would go through years and narrate, months would go by just in narration and off screen, where it felt a lot more lived in than some of the more high fantasy games that I play.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah.
Regarding the idea that medieval folk tended to stay in their lane, generally speaking, there was a Roman emperor who set up laws that were essentially like, if your parents did this, you're doing it by law. But that's in WFRP balanced against the idea that player characters are by definition like not average folk. They're breaking conventions. All WFRP characters are in a sense an outlaw because they're traveling, they're having adventures. Like they're not going to sit in their village and get experience points making charcoal or whatever.
Yeah. So, otherwise, you'd never have an elf or a dwarf character slumming around with humans.
Yeah.
So true.
Yeah, Rangdos. I've run a couple of all road warden one shots. Can recommend. I quite like all one career. We all started as nobles when we were playing WFRP 2nd edition, and what were we doing? The Ashes of Middenheim. And we were 3 nobles. I think there was only 3 of us to start with that we met on the road, and that was quite interesting because we did explore different. It's different being an adventurer when you're a noble, but then you run out of money and you're just like a normal person.
To a degree, that was also a bit of a stress tester on the old rules because it was the first system where the first time where there was very clear either or definitely in place. So characters could manifest in slightly different ways, even though they were using the same career. And we kind of ran with that just to see how well that could come out. I mean, inevitably, we could obviously make separate characters because that's what's attached on top of the rules. But were they going to look like carbon copies of each other? And as it turned out, they did not.
They absolutely did not.
We similarly had a point where maybe not all of us, but quite a lot of us were playing wizards as well from different orders, and that was particularly good because, again, we were all wizards, but we were all from very different orders, so we had very different social structures, very different backgrounds and things as well. So, yeah.
It's like its own caste system within its own caste system, which I really liked about the wizard orders more so than the different religious orders, because other than Ulfric and Sigmar, and I guess Shalia to some degree, it never really felt like the religion, the pantheons, their structure was ever really an important part. Like when you read the novels or when you go through the adventures, it's basically a Shalia for healing when you guys are hurt, Sigmar, Ulfric, because that's where your big zealots tend to congregate. But then a lot of the others, like Tall, and nobody else really got Manon, got a lot of focus or attention.
Mm-hmm.
I'd actually agree with Games Workshop's official output in particular. Games Workshop tended to always focus on, in their novels, the core ones with occasional mentions of other gods off to the side whenever they pass through the terrain of the week. So we're passing through this forest, I'll say, oh, Tal's horns. And that's that particular job done. Where I think Fantasy Roleplay 2 did a good stab into the religious side of things in an attempt to
add... Rando says... Toma, Salvation is one of the best Wolfram.
Well, thank you very much. I may have written a large chunk of that book. There you go. Thank you very much. But, silliness aside, because that was the first book where quite a few of the cults were expanded in a way that they just hadn't been before. Myrmidia, for example, previous to that point, was effectively just Pallas Athene, uplift and transfer. She was Athena, but not very well represented at all in Warhammer, nor very well described. And quite a lot of extra depth was added then. But did that ever then move on to hit the later books? Occasionally, here or there. But Games Workshop's primary point of concentration was never that. So then when we come around to third edition and you look at, again, Games Workshop's output, you're right. It's Ulrich. It's occasionally more. But it's definitely Sigmar. It's occasionally Shalia. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I was going to say what I found is trying to go into some of the other cults is when I ran into the most friction with Games Workshop, because they didn't cover a lot of that ground. It was harder for me to get things approved because I either had to give everything a wink and a nod to something else that already existed. Otherwise, there wasn't really a lot to build on.
So the person I hired to write the religion section of the second edition core rulebook is Aaron Loeb. And he had written something called the Book of the Righteous for us back in 2002, which was a complete pantheon and mythology for D20 games that we later updated to 5th edition. So it's back in print if people are interested in that. But what's great about it is that, like, Aaron's a student of mythology, and he really tried to create something that went into, like, the churches of the various gods. So if you want to worship the god of strength, there was some dogma you could at least get ideas from, other than, like, being strong is the best. So which doesn't really take you too far, as far as characterization goes. So that's why I hired him to do that chapter.
I've always when I've run games, it was recently when I was thinking of how to portray, like, the cult of Sigmar, other than how it's the kind of what I call kind of top level layer of it that you always experience from, like, the war games and so forth. Is I got into my head, it's like, is the Warhammer world and its faith with Sigmar basically our world, if rather than the Church of Christ, going through from Roman period into the Middle Ages and onwards, whether the cult of Mithras hadn't been usurped, because obviously it has similarities between those cults and their origins and some of their mythology, but the cult of Mithras, obviously Mithras is a much more martial god than the Church of Christ. So is that a kind of a parallel that you can go for to help kind of, again, get your thought process into how Sigmar operates, other than just a warrior priest with a big hammer?
I think it's an interesting idea. I think I always tried to take the pantheon and turn it back into, and what did that mean for the social structure and fabric of Warhammer? And I think the thing you have to remember is those gods do real miracles. And so, yeah, Sigmar gets real miracles, but it's not like if Jesus had been Mithras, because what wins out in... You can tell my beliefs. What wins out in real world religions is who can make the best argument. Whereas what wins out in Warhammer is the fact that people are blessed. People have magic. And those people who have magic and who are blessed are not necessarily the people who have power. Like in our world, you know, the structures that have power get stuck there. And that's what I find incredibly like attractive and interesting about a fantasy world like the WFRP world.
For Sigmar, I always thought about what if Mark Antony or Alexander the Great had gone through apotheosis and kind of look at it that way. There's this established structure and regiment that everybody goes through, and then all of a sudden your leader is now a god. So how does that change how you do things? It's really, really interesting to think about. But what I found is sometimes I would have players who would deliberately avoid that because they didn't. I'm like, I'm here to play and relax. I don't want to deal with religion in a fake world like I have to in the real world.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if other people ever found that there were just some careers, areas, or topics that people are like, I do this enough in my real life. I don't need to do it in role playing too.
Yeah, and that applies to quite a lot of things. We've talked about some issues in role-playing games, how much you want to explore certain issues as a GM around the table with your players, because for some players it's just a case of, like I said to Andy when we started playing WFRP, and this was like, I don't know, 20 years ago, I was pretty young, I'm not interested if you tell me I can't do stuff because I'm a woman. It's bullshit. I don't want to hear that in a role-playing game, because I face that every day in real life, and I'm a white person. I've got that privilege. I would imagine that would be the same for someone who has different, diversity characteristics than I have, and so it irks me slightly when I see people talking about on forums and stuff. Yeah, well, it's like Germany. It's not like Germany. Germany didn't have wizards and gods. And...
I mean, in particular, you can call out that Germany didn't have a pantheon of gods that survived through to the modern day that blessed people that were not, as you said earlier, the people who are traditionally in power. If you are blessed of Myrmidia and you happen to be a 5'1" woman from a background that is just not... Oh, pardon me. Yeah, quite. That's from a background that's quite different to the established power base, and the god is literally blessing you. It's very difficult for the established power base to fight against that without going nasty, which inevitably sometimes it will. That's the whole joy issue with established cults. But that friction can be an awful lot of fun as well. But it was an issue even when back writing for Chris. Back in the day. Hi, Chris. And when, because I wrote the Sigmar sections in the Tome of Salvation, for example, and there was resistance to even adding Nuns of Sigmar at that point. But fortunately, Mordheim had very recently done them. So there was no leg for others to stand on for me to not do it. So I added in a quite clear reference to not just one branch of them, they were everywhere. There was all manner of nundoms out there, orders that were female worshippers of Sigmar, and that's not an issue for that cult. And Sigmar blesses across genders equally, regardless of what they identify as. And I figured that was super important even back then.
So I'm going to take a little pivot to something. Obviously we can't talk about first edition here, and I think this is a good one to talk about next week as well, but have all editions felt the influence of GW to the same level? And Jay, you talked about your experience a little bit.
Yeah, it was interesting because there were a lot of things where my personal licensing manager pushed back and said, you can't do this, and then Alan Merritt would say, oh no, that's completely cool. And the licensing manager would be caught in the middle of it, which was really, really awkward. But there were some things that we deliberately stayed away from. That's one reason why we didn't go higher tier, is there's less said outside of something that has an army unit in the tabletop game surrounding some of the higher tier stuff. But down in the dirt, that's where most of the novels take place. That's where a lot of, I guess, the core gameplay loop for most role-playing games is you play through the early years, the early time. But I had to prove to the licensing manager that I cared about WFRP as much as they did before they gave us more freedom to explore things. It was a real tight leash at the beginning. I don't know if everybody else felt that way.
Well, so I think it's I think we had different experiences because after Fantasy Flight got the license, they hired us to do a book called Shades of Empire.
Yep.
That was the last Warhammer book that we did, but under contract to them instead of GW. And when we were working directly with GW, like we would get so many comments and so much feedback and, red lines that were just like endless. And then when Shades of Empire got submitted, it was different people who were handling that stuff. And it came back and they asked for like 2 changes in the entire book. Yeah. And my response was, those lucky bastards.
The main thing is, so I inherited Shades of Empire. That was the first product that I worked on. I had to redo it in layout and I had to re-edit parts of it. And I have to admit that the licensing manager was like, so we're at the end of the line, right? Yeah, this in the career compendium. All right, then let's just get this done with. And they signed off on stuff that they said that they would never sign off on at the beginning of a print run or a beginning of a game run. Because they were just like, let's wrap this up, tie it up with a bow, and say goodbye to it. And then I'm like, oh, that's not bad at all. And it was a completely different expectation. And suddenly that core box comes out and they're like, no. We do this whole thing. All of this art blows. There aren't enough spikes and there aren't enough skulls.
I'll go from a slightly different angle because my relationship with Games Workshop was great. Actually, I was quite lucky because one of the reasons I was brought on, in a similar fashion I was brought on for some of the later second edition books, was because I was seen as the IP guy by many, because I knew the Warhammer world back to front. And once I got chatting to them, and when some issues came up and they said, you probably shouldn't do this, and I'd reply normally with well, this is what's said here, here, and here. What would you rather? This is the sources for these things. They're not just made up. What would you prefer? They generally come back with oh, that's great. Brilliant. Just do that one, away you go. And after the core book, I pretty much got hardly a single red line for anything, much like Chris was suggesting for Shades of the Empire. There's a few bits and pieces here or there. Occasionally, they'd spot something that we missed, and that happens sometimes. But broadly, we were already in a very strong position because luckily, the people that we had working on those parts were so deeply into Warhammer that everything that they were suggesting to go into the books was already something that Games Workshop wanted to be in there. So it was to a degree working from a very easy place where I know for a fact that other people dealing with exactly the same people weren't in the same place, and they were getting lots suggested changes and a variety of things. But we were lucky, but it's because we happened to be just offering what Games Workshop wanted to hear at that point. And I'm sure that as Games Workshop goes through its cycles, as Jay suggested, with its staff changes, with a different set of licensing people coming in at different points, new teams will probably find it completely different again. Because as the staff cycles round, different experience.
So I had a different experience 10 years ago. I was hired to work a 40K MMO down in Austin, which never came out because that company was a disaster, but I lived down there for 10 months and I was like the narrative lead for the game, and I was hired specifically to be the lore guy. And so like I knew the 40K setting really well, and I had all the sources at my fingertips and whatever, and I could make the case, of like, like, look, chapter and verse, like it's in, the Imperial Guard uplifting primer, like here's the quote, and still be shut down. So
It can happen. I mean, I'll give a single example of that one. Whenever we were doing things that were considered to be different, and I'll do one that's such a classic one that everyone will know it. In Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1, you get a 3-legged goblin right at the very beginning in the Enemy Within campaign. And when we were redoing the Enemy Within campaign, that came up as a potential issue. But again, it was a discussion. Is it what Games Workshop now say goblins are? Can we still do this? Can we not do this? And I think that my angle was always they're going to have last call, whether that would be my preference or not. So you're just better having the best relationship you can and giving them options rather than trying to argue, because that's inevitably just they're going to fail. But equally, pushing back if there was something that had to be pushed back on. And I had a really good relationship. We were all in the same team, basically. They were on the Warhammer side. I was on the People 7 side when I was working for them. But nevertheless, we were all working on the same product, wanting it to be the best. And I think that was the best aspect of that relationship, was that it felt like we were all part of the same team, which I think made it easier to include some things that other people didn't expect to get into the final product.
We have been asked about the Alphonse controversy, but I think we're going to steer clear of that tonight.
Other than to perhaps say it might be connected to what's just been discussed?
Yeah, indeed. It's pretty much directly associated with that. The Alphonse controversy is Gnomes in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Alphonse de Gascoigne, named after Marco, who's going to be with us in a couple of weeks, actually, Mark Gascoigne. He's a rather famous Fantasy Roleplay 1 character. When Plundered Vaults came out, Fantasy Roleplay 2, no, it's not even Plundered Vaults at all, actually. That changed a different gnome. A gnome was turned into a halfling, and most recently in Fantasy Roleplay 4, gnomes were reintroduced, and then the most famous gnome character, Alphonse, was turned into a halfling. And that has caused a controversy amongst a certain aspect of the fan base.
Having been a gnome in another publication, right?
Yes.
So he's been both a gnome and a halfling in 4th
No,
edition.
he's never been a halfling before. He's a halfling now in Fantasy Roleplay 4. Yeah.
Halflings were always difficult territory because they were always described with some language. I don't know what kind of language you've set for this, but one of the direct quotes from Alan Merritt was pretty crazy. They had to be grubby. They had to be stupid. They had to be greasy and either. I'm not going to repeat it, but it was pretty vital. The analogy that he gave about this is what a halfling is, and this is everything a halfling is not. That was crazy. That was one of the best.
I think in 4th edition, Andy, you've had a halfling on the cover of which book is it?
On the cover?
Yeah, there's a halfling in the background that you commissioned to be next to children.
Oh, that's on one of the PDFs, yeah.
Yeah, on one of the PDFs to clearly show, because there's this like little halflings are just like little half-sized people, but to clearly show how different the halfling was to a human, how they couldn't be mistaken for a human child, how they're, they've got like more teeth in their mouth, they're just
bigger,
and they're not just a kind of human.
Yeah, on the halfling front, we when I wrote the section for halflings in the core book for 4, there was an issue because there's so little written about them that's not just either a Tolkien ripoff or alternatively the Blood Bowl halflings, for want of a better description, the halflings that have their halfling hot pots and throw them into their opponent's army and have very little in the way of real character. There was little in the way that ground them in reality. So a little bit of time was spent to try and add a bit of character to them, to work on their clan structure, to work on who they were. And I was really happy that wasn't turned down because it was an area that was, if not covered, it would have been a bit of a hole in terms of the presentation of all the other species that Fantasy Roleplay 4 offered, because they would have had the full development, and then there would have just been this hole for halflings where you'd have gone, yeah, they're kind of hobbits, but not.
That's literally the last thing I wrote for 4th edition was that Halfling Clans of the Reichland article from the Archives of the Empire. And again, in terms of approvals, like I'm amazed that got approved. I genuinely was expecting it to get pushed back because we've got them in canon being like polygamous and stuff like that. And I thought they'll never let me do that. No, they have. Awesome.
I'm right.
Yeah.
Well, so I worked on Blood Bowl 2, which is Warhammer adjacent, and I wanted to make a halfling team, but the main pushback was they cannot be competitive. So if you want them in the game, you have to create a team that really doesn't work well with anything else that you've designed for this game or work with the expansions. They have to be terrible or you can't make it.
Hey, look, it's Graham. Graham
Hi,
Davis
Graham.
has popped up in the chat. Halflings were always considered a joke in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and to make things worse, the minis never sold, so it was hard to get anything done for them in Warhammer.
And I think to a degree that spun into second edition, and Chris will be able to probably talk about that more in terms of his relationship with halflings. But on my side, it wasn't that much different when I was looking to write something for them. And what could you do other than try to add a bit of depth and hope that they could have just a bit more character there?
But the hot pots, are we to believe that halflings would throw food away? I mean, come on.
I mean, come on. Yeah, even the deeply acidic food. Seriously, no.
Yeah. I've got the miniatures, by the way, but
I did like the I had a halfling hot pot in my Empire army. I'm happy to admit, and a whole regiment of halflings in my Empire army. I did enjoy them. But
going back to one of the really earlier questions that I think, Jay, you probably just missed. You came in when we were finishing it off, and that was about what made it particularly Warhammer. That's what how we got into careers, and some people said insanity, corruption, miscasts. One thing I liked about third edition was the way it felt like a little bit of a callback to Warhammer Quest in having like cards in front of you. So it felt more like a spiritual successor to Warhammer Quest in a way than it did, or even to Fantasy Battle when you used to have your magic item cards. Like it had a bit of a feel about it. So it was totally different dice system, different construct, but still had something about it that made me remember playing my elf in Warhammer Quest with Andy Leeskin, stealing all his kills for gold.
One of the things that sold the system was that you could do things aggressively or conservatively. So being able to show like a troll slayer can only perform these things aggressively was one of the things that sold him, because we had this attack for troll slayers, and he's like, just don't even put a conservative side on it. Say troll slayers aren't conservative, so flip it to the other side. So we got to have some fun with it, but the conservative and reckless way that you could approach tasks was one thing that GW liked, and ended up by the fans being one of the things that, for all the things that didn't feel woofrup to them about third edition, and they were not shy about telling me what, the people who got into it are like, wow, this is actually really, really cool that I can approach the Duke differently. I can approach him all full of rage and vim and vigor, or kind of we take our time about it, we talk about it, and that worked really well, I guess.
Much like the dice, it told stories. And it helped tell stories, much like career exits, it told stories. And each of the editions has got its own little tools which help promote that. And I agree completely on the dice front. And the reckless conservative was a great mechanic. It did things, and you could do things with it. And it wasn't just a simple mechanic. It worked on the spells, so the spells would manifest differently if you cast them aggressively or if you cast them more conservatively. It meant that, say, for example, the way third edition presented Tal and Raya, where they were effectively one cult. On one side, you had the conservative Raya, on the other, the aggressive Tal. And different ways of presenting the material was fun. And it made it a fun read as well. So it made it something that was more than just a system you could use. It was a game you could read. So it was an enjoyable component of the experience of playing the game. Something that is forgotten by quite a lot of games, both one, that they're a game, and two, that they're often consumed, never to be played. A lot of players out there never actually play the games they buy. They just buy and buy and buy. They play their favorite games of the week, so they might play 1 or 2 sessions of a game. But people forgetting that it should be a good read too. And that added a certain aspect to it, because there was always the question of what's it going to be on the other side. Takes you through it.
Yeah.
I was going to jump in and say, quickly jump in and say that I haven't played. I don't think I played more than 1 or 2 sessions of 3, but I have played like recently the Star Wars system based on it, and it's wonderful for that. For the way that it tells a story with the rule system. And I was just thinking, like, how much of that informed the version of informed Wrath and Glory's design as well, because again you've got like the different icons and that's used to get effects in there. So it's curious how that I can see some kind of line of thought that went into that design.
You have to ask.
Yeah, I'd have to ask the right people.
Ross, have you designed it? Kind of Ross Watson, I think.
Even Avengers just has put a comment saying the 3rd edition dice can explain why you succeeded, something the D100 systems have never managed. I agree.
I disagree to that to a degree. I'd say the D100 systems, there's a variety of different rules, including some of them in 4th, where you don't just have a yes or a no. You've got a yes and, or a no and, or a yes no.
Yep.
There are aspects of it. For example, in Warhammer Fantasy Rugby 4, you can both fumble and win in a contested roll. So you can hit someone and drop your sword. And that's based off of D100. You can critical hit on someone and also lose that combat. There's all manner of different ways that the dice can express with the mechanics as they stand. But they're not necessarily as transparent for what they are in terms of, say, for example, the 3E dice, where I was strongly influenced by when we were putting the core of what 4 was into place, because there was so much that came from that game that I didn't want to lose, because the stories being told by the dice were as much fun in many respects as the stories being told at the table by whatever the scenario at hand was.
The biggest goal was to avoid the D&D situation of you get +2 for flanking and -2 because it's dark. So it's the same as if nothing happened. Right. So the whole canceling modifier, so they're no longer part of the story, was what I was trying to skirt with that. And to a degree, what I was always caught up with in a percentile system as well is if you get a +10 bonus and a -10 penalty, then do they even matter?
Agreed.
Yeah. I think about 3rd edition, the thing about it which made it more immersive is because in the percentile system, like, you always know what your chance of success is, but I could never work out those 30. I could never work out, like, how likely is it? Like,
that was intentional.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a really good intent, because in real life you don't know how likely things are. So I think it actually some of the things that I think people didn't like about it, because those dice were quite, I don't know,
wonky.
Yeah. Actually, yeah.
But isn't that wonkiness, like that wonkiness I've seen again, another game I've written some stuff for is for Soulbound. I think you see that wonkiness in a sense that you can go, if I add that die of whichever color, whichever one it is, I can't remember, you kind of go, I should definitely more likely to succeed. But if I add that kind of die, your potential to succeed wildly is even more. And I think, but also your potential to fail abysmally is even greater. And I think I really like that. So when I see people complain like, oh, adding the changing the target number, but also adding dice to the pool, aren't those both cancelling out? It's like, well, no, because you can get tons of criticals with more dice. Even if the target number is higher, they're telling two different things about the challenge you're up against.
So I've had a lot of people who, when they went back to the percentile system, kept the boost and setback dice, or the boon and bane dice, because they're like, oh, these are just little side effects that can happen. And if it comes up good, then we can at least narrate why the darkness, impeded you. And it doesn't take away from the percentile result, but it's just helping tell the little side stories that we've invented along the way, which I thought was a cool way to combine one thing that they liked about 3rd edition with their primary love, which was going back to the percentile system.
Yeah.
Graham says it made it a challenge to design for. I don't know who he's answering. Is he answering?
I think the special dice. Yeah.
Yeah, the special dice.
Right. This is getting out of control. So there are now people in the chat asking Graham questions in the chat, and Graham isn't even on this stream. Yeah. I've lost it. So
it's done. In defense of percentile dice, a lot of RPGs, when you're teaching new people how to play them, and you're just telling them, oh, roll these dice, roll that dice. They don't really know what's going on. They have no understanding of how good they are at things and how much of a chance they have to do things. And I like the percentiles because it's always clear. You can say to someone, like, you have a 30% chance to hit, and that is understandable to anybody.
I'm agreed completely. One of the, I think, the biggest additions to second edition that was carried right through to fourth was fortune points, because it helped cope with the fact that your core beginning in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay tends to be relatively low in your percentage chance of passing. And bringing those fortune points on, tacking them to your fate points as well, suggesting that they are for the special people, really made a big difference. I thought it was a marvelous and simple change to help deal with the whiff, so to speak, of first edition.
Rangdo says they prefer a transparent percentage system for skills, but an opaque system for magic to make magic literally unpredictable and different. Like when we're traveling, Andy randomizes things, or like if he needs a random result, by making all the players roll a dice, and we never know. Like, is it that we should all be rolling different numbers? Is it going to be a problem if we roll the same number? And 8 is obviously always bad in WFRP, but yeah, an opaque system can be quite thematically appropriate for WFRP.
To a degree, it's what second did.
Certainly sympathetic to the narrative side of things, you know, and so, you know, I totally understand the idea of trying to make the story more than I whack you, you whack me, I whack you. So.
Avon Avengers said, I thought Lindsay meant traveling in real life.
Roll dice, Lindsay.
I played through what you were describing, and that's what I thought you meant as well.
No, I'm talking about her agreement.
Which bus will we get?
No, I meant when we travel from, you know, Castle Wittgenstein back up to Outdoor.
But I agree with Chris completely on the whole, both wanting to have that desire to try and break the I whack you, you whack me story. Also the transparency of the percentile dice and why it is super useful for teaching. It's, in some respects, I was lucky because Chris I stood on the backs of giants, so to speak, because Chris did so much hard work to try and resolve much of what was wrong with first. Which was a wild stab in the dark in many respects, and had lots of balancing issues, many of which he completely eradicated. And I was in a very lucky position where I could look at those and say, right, so what are we left with and what issues do we have to fix? And then Jay comes along and says, hey, have you considered adding story to your dice rolls? And with a few small tweaks, you could add that to a percentile roll. And that was done. And I could just sit there, feel super smug. Feeling like I'd done loads, while the hard work had clearly been done by other people in previous editions. Thanks, guys.
That's the sort of impulse that led to the entire stunt system in the adventure game engine, which is really like the sort of killer app of age games. So, you know, it started as kind of a dynamic critical hit system, but then it's branched out where you can have stunts now in role-playing scenes and exploration scenes during chases and all this stuff. Just livens things up.
It's a fun rule.
There's a question about comparing percentile-based magic systems.
Well, I mean, to put that very simply, on one choice, you've got a different system for magic and skill resolution, where with 4th edition, they went for the same resolution for both skills and magic and everything else. It's just a D100 roll for the lot. And it's just different ways of doing it. Which one's best? It's down to personal preferences to a degree. 2nd edition kind of copied the battle game, where it had a completely separate system for how magic was dealt with. And it worked well. Yeah. And 4th just went with, it's one system you need to teach all the players.
And there was another aspect of it as well, Andy, because I remember the conversation between you and me about it as well. And it goes back to that really early question about what's baked in terms of the Warhammer setting. And the key thing for me was, like, on a metaphysical level, magic points don't make sense in Warhammer. in that it's the winds of magic, and I was like, I want the magic system in RPG to reflect that. Now you can argue that it does. You can argue that the magic points are how much the wizard can kind of hold, and I get that. But I wanted the hard baked system to reflect the fact that you were drawing on something elemental rather than your own kind of internal reservoir. And as soon as I eliminated magic points, that kind of in my head eliminated dice pools as well. And the logical thing was to make it a single system. So it's not exactly what I would make it if I had time to do it all over. But yeah.
Any of us ended up mixing editions in your game? Well, we play with the AE version.
I haven't played any edition since second, I have to say. So no.
Fair.
Yes, would be my one. I am a constant fiddler and tinkerer of all things, and I've played every edition, and I played every edition a lot. And I have stolen, bridged, picked and chosen which rules I particularly like and used whatever felt best for the game at hand. But 4, in many respects, is a modified version of 2, because that's where it sort of came from, with extra additions from Dom, who had rules that he wanted to add, like resolve and resilience, for example, or the advantage mechanics. And it was a merging of those two things into a nice, simple, hopefully, outcome. And that, compared to the games I play today, which inevitably take all the bits I like from the systems I like and ditch the bits I don't. So, yes. And I
one of the things that a lot of I had to delay that. One of the things a lot of people in Discord, I think, said that they kept from 3rd is the party tension, the idea of the party having a name and it being its own thing. And we actually, I didn't realize, but actually we did keep that in a way, Andy Lease, because remember we named our party and we were much more attached to the party after our experience playing 3rd than we ever had been in 1st and 2nd.
It was a good
3/4 of the sausage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had 2 halflings in our party. I think that explains all you need to know.
From the very beginning, I wanted that first session, we meet in a pub and go down and kill rats in the basement, to feel more important, and creating your party as its own character as the last step of character creation helped make sure that there was a reason why all the characters knew each other. So we don't have to spend an entire session talking about that. We can start talking about what we're doing now and our aspirations, and we can fill in other backstory details as we go. People either, most of 3rd edition was extremely polarizing. People either really, really liked or really, really disliked a certain item, and the party system was one of those polarizing elements. But that was one of the milestones for me that is like, we are on the right track here.
Yeah, I loved it.
It's interesting I'll add one little bit. In 4th, I wanted to include something like that, didn't really have the opportunity, so we just left it down with a long-term ambition for the party, so that there was that consideration amongst the players where they had to get together and decide what the party as a whole was working towards, which hopefully to a degree helped give that feeling of you're working together and you shouldn't be splitting up. Oh my goodness, don't split the party up. Help, the GM starts crying. All those small nudges in that direction.
So is there direction from GW about what parts of the Warhammer world you should explore?
Bretonnia was always off limits. Lustria was always off limits. Araby was always off limits. Let's see. Going up into Norska, it really depended. We were able to do an adventure like on the edges, but there were more places where they said, don't go here, rather than pushing us to spend more time in the Reichland or in Mariensburg or something like that, for me.
Yeah, I mean, they wanted us to concentrate on the Empire. They did let us do a couple Bretonian books, which was nice, but and we did something with the Border Princes, David Chart wrote. But I want to do something in Araby, and we couldn't. I was actually very interested to see that that Total War Warhammer has been allowed to develop Cathay in the old world, and they're adding it as a full-fledged faction with, new troop types and characters and blah blah blah. Like, we could never have done that. So
I can discuss that.
Good on them.
I can discuss that one a little bit. By the time we'd hit fourth, the leeway that we had was both much tighter, far tighter and broader. And by that I mean, when I first was hired, it was a game about Ubersreich, and that was it. And through the largely because of third, and through the development of my input, that then turned into all of Reichland, which really was kind of needed, given everything that was moving out from that point. And I then asked, when I was in control of the whole thing, where can I go? And I was told pretty much anywhere except for. And my except fors were Araby and Cathay in a similar fashion. But I was given free rein to go almost anywhere else. So I planned up an entire book to go to Lustria, through Althuin, through Albion, and that was all cool. We had that whole adventure pitched up and organized. We announced it about 3 years ago now, and Gav Thorpe was going to be writing it. That's before I moved on from the job. But we had a whole thing in place there, which was going to be super cool and awesome. And I asked about Cathay several times because I thought that would be awesome. Absolutely no. And at that point, Sega were doing their expansions, Fantasy Roleplay 2 for Total War 2. And they were wanting to do the Cathay faction as well. And obviously that didn't happen. Interestingly, though, you may note that there was the Three Kingdoms game that came from Total War Studio not long after that. And it was really quite successful. And now we have ourselves an entire Warhammer set up for Cathay. One feels that there may have been a knock-on effect from that. And for me personally, I think that's great because the Warhammer world is almost caught up in the, you almost don't want to say it, but in a lot of the racist tropes that it dealt with back in the 80s without even realizing what it was doing most of the time. It's an old game with an awful lot of old ideas wrapped into it, some of which are unfortunate. And that's going to come hand in hand with a certain level of fear from the people who own that IP about not wanting to repeat the past. So I'm super pleased to see that they are expanding outwards because it shows that hopefully those fears from the past can be eradicated and they can move on and create something that is super awesome.
Yeah. One of the things that I've always wanted on a wish list as a non-developer and only writing a small bit on Warhammer Fantasy 4e so far is a Mordheim setting book because I just feel like it's historical. So, I mean, Warhammer's now technically historical anyway by the Age of Sigmar standards anyway. But also because I feel like Mordheim's just like this perfect sandbox setting because you just go in there and you're going for Warpstone. Your reason is there; it's baked in. Go steal Warpstone, and you're dealing with you can mostly have quite a good focused kind of setting where it's obvious what you're doing and obvious where your antagonisms will come from rival parties. Yeah, that's my wish list though.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I'd play that.
Definitely. And I think Andy and I had a plan to sneak Araby in our magic book. In that we were going to talk about how magic worked in that part of the world where you were far away from the winds didn't really blow properly. And by doing that, we would be able to, our plan was to sort of essentially sneak in enough hints about the culture in a way that wasn't racist, that might then buy us the trust that we needed to then get us to expand on it more kind of in the future. That was our kind of grand plan. But...
Andy, you're on mute.
Of course I am. There was it's a rare occurrence. There was an Arabian reference here or there. There was one in the starter set, for example. There was a particular weapon that was from Arabian manufacturer. We were allowed to discuss it, but it was always an extra outside area that should not be developed because that was their job, basically.
I mean, there are definitely like 80s attitudes, from the period, of that era. Sometimes just snobbery. I mean, like the early editions of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, like the army standard of Bretonnia was called La Grande Orifice. And that was, it's like a little dig at French people. Yeah.
Oh, what's the other one? It's the Strigony, is it? Who are a basically, coded Roma type culture who are tied to one of the bloodlines of the vampire counts, and I think we podcast about that on Dark Days Radio like a while ago, and it's like, this is painful.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, it could be worse. Like the World of Darkness Gypsies, which is just like the worst book ever.
Yeah.
That's not a good book.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that book.
I'm sorry to remind you.
Yeah.
Let me just say that Scarsickle's comment makes me smile because I made that joke. Indeed, I made that joke. Come the midnight hour, we cry more. That's. I wrote that to the group. I couldn't help myself.
I remember the point where you said it. You just said it, and then you went, "That's going in." Literally ran to the computer and typed it
in. From Father Wilhelm Gottlieb, not Billy Idol at all. It's preaching to somebody or another. That was written as one of the quotations. That was quite fun. That's something that was quite fun for 4th because we had a little bit more leeway to jump into the old puns and humor of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And a lot of the fear, I think, of that came from some pretty bad ones, as suggested already, that came from the earlier editions, where some of them were just unfortunate. They just were. And you look at them nowadays and you go, I really wish that wasn't there. And I'm not going to reproduce that in anything that I do. I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable. And there was almost, if you look through, say, the Warhammer game, it almost wildly moved away from that after 4th edition of the battle game. As you move into 5th and 6th, it became grimmer and darker and more black and white illustrations and far less of the humor and puns. And that came through into the roleplay game as well through 2nd and 3rd, I would say. Where there was less humor per se. But that very much was something that I was quite happy to be able to reintroduce because I love a bad pun.
We all do.
I'm a dad. It's my job.
Spikes and skulls.
That too.
I think that we've
bar.
got through quite a lot of questions, pre-questions. I think that's aired some things that we won't now need to talk about next week, or James and Graham can jump in and talk about instead. Oh, it took Vagrant 456 30 years to get
it's
Graf
the most
once
beautiful pun ever. Graf once upon a time. Once upon a time, the Graf was there. It's just a beautiful joke.
So what started out today? What started out today, about 4 hours ago, as me and Andy Law going to talk to each other, has turned into this kind of epic ride of Warhammer with 6 of us. Thank you, Jay and Chris Pramas and Chris Handley, for coming on at such short notice and joining us for a bit of a chat. And hang on at the end to see what's coming up on Inside the Rookery over the next few weeks.
I'll also add, just to make sure that we've definitely said it, because people might not know, we have Graham Davis, obviously, whom almost everybody will know, coming along for the Fantasy Roleplay Dev Chat next week. From 1st edition, he was the developer and designer through 1st edition through Games Workshop into Flame. We also have James Wallace coming along, who was the 1st edition developer when it was in Hogshead, which James ran. And then you have the rest of us too. But just worth mentioning that they'll be along for next week as well, and they'll have a completely different view, because they were dealing with a game which was almost at its infancy in a very different way. And I'm sure that, as Graham will mention, and more than one, yes, the barge burner, as somebody has mentioned, which is worth bringing that comment up. Good old James Wallace. The infamous barge burner, which of course we referenced in Fantasy Roleplay 4 as well, with a quotation, but you have to do that. Forking barge burners. That was Clive Oldfield who made that one. The forking barge. Because we didn't want to write fucking barge into the actual rulebook, because that might not have passed approval.
maybe.
So yes, it's going to be quite the chat, and good luck marshalling us, Lindsay.
I'll try my best. But thank you all for this evening, and I will speak to you all again soon.
All right, thanks.
Thanks everyone. Bye.